Sometimes the truth does not break your heart. It reveals that it was already broken long before you dared to look. The night Sebastian Blackwood chose to become someone else, the wind pressed cold fingers against the tall windows of Whitmore Manor, rattling the glass like a warning he refused to hear, and beneath the dim gold of candlelight, the Duke, one of the most feared men in all of England, stood silent in a servant's coat that did not belong to him, his gloved hands now bare, his name now nothing. Because power could command loyalty but never truth, and truth was the one thing he had come to claim. The gravel had crunched beneath his boots just an hour earlier as he arrived not as a guest, but as a shadow, slipping through the servants' entrance while laughter echoed faintly from distant rooms, a house alive with illusion, with whispers of a marriage soon to be sealed, his marriage, arranged, negotiated, inevitable. And yet something had felt wrong from the moment her name had first been placed beside his, Clara Whitmore. A woman spoken of in polished tones yet never with warmth, described as proper, distant, obedient, words that felt too carefully chosen, too hollow to be real, and Sebastian, a man who had survived war, betrayal, and years of silence, had learned one thing above all. When something appeared perfect, it was usually hiding a fracture deep beneath the surface. So he watched, unseen, unnoticed, moving through corridors where polished marble swallowed sound and heavy drapes breathed shadows. And then he saw her, not as the world presented her, but as she was when no one important was watching, kneeling beside a trembling maid whose hands had spilled tea across fine linen, Clara's voice soft, steady, nothing like the cold figure he had been promised. "It's only fabric," she murmured, pressing a cloth into the girl's shaking fingers. "Not something worth your fear." And the servant looked at her, as if she were something rare, something safe, and for the first time, doubt cracked through Sebastian's certainty. Because this was not the woman he had expected, not the woman who would marry him without question, not the woman who would look at him as duty rather than destiny. And yet as she rose, smoothing the simple lines of her dress, her expression shifted, the softness folding back into something controlled, something distant, like a door quietly closing, and he felt it then, a strange, unwelcome pull, as if the truth he had come to uncover was already beginning to unravel him instead. Hours passed like a slow breath held too long, until night settled fully over the manor and silence deepened into something intimate, something dangerous, and it was then, standing in the dim corridor beyond a half-closed door, that Sebastian heard her voice again, quieter now, stripped of all pretense, and without choosing it. He stopped, because something in the way she spoke carried a weight that felt like the edge of a blade, and though he had come seeking answers, he did not yet understand that the moment he chose to listen, everything he believed about her, and about himself, would begin to break. The corridor seemed to narrow around him as her voice slipped through the half-opened door, softer now, stripped of the composure she wore before others, and Sebastian found himself unable to move, his breath held somewhere between instinct and disbelief, as though even the air feared to disturb what was about to be revealed. "I will marry him," Clara said, each word measured yet trembling beneath its surface, and the quiet reply of another woman, perhaps her companion, came uncertain and low, asking the question Sebastian had not dared to form himself. "Do you care for him at all?" And for a single fragile second, silence answered, a silence so complete it felt like the entire manor leaned in to listen, and then Clara exhaled, a sound almost too soft to exist. "That is precisely why I must not," she whispered, and something cold and sharp pressed against Sebastian's chest, confusion flickering into something far more dangerous, because those were not the words of indifference, not the careless dismissal he had expected, but neither were they a confession he could understand, and he remained there, unmoving, as if stepping away would shatter the fragile thread of truth unraveling before him. Inside the room, the faint crackle of a dying fire marked the passing seconds, and Clara's voice returned, steadier now, though the effort behind it was unmistakable. "If I allow myself to feel anything, even the smallest thing, it will become something I cannot survive losing." And the words struck him with a force no raised voice ever could, quiet, deliberate, impossible to ignore. "Men like him do not marry for love," she continued, each syllable carefully controlled. They marry for legacy, for alliances, for duty, and I would only be a piece on that board. Her companion protested softly, speaking of kindness, of rumors that spoke differently of the Duke. But Clara only shook her head, the faint rustle of fabric betraying the motion. Rumors are stories we tell to soften the truth, she said, and there was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet resignation that felt heavier than grief. Even if he were kind, even if he were everything those stories claim, it would not change what I am. And Sebastian felt something shift beneath his feet, as though the solid ground of certainty he had carried all his life had begun to fracture in silence. Because she was not rejecting him, not dismissing him, she was removing herself from the possibility before it could ever begin, and the realization settled into him slowly, painfully, like winter creeping through stone walls. So you will pretend? The other voice asked, almost pleading now, and Clara's answer came after a pause that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. No, she said quietly. I will do what is required, and I will do it well. Another pause, softer this time. But I will not hope. And something inside Sebastian tightened at that word, hope, spoken as though it were the most dangerous thing a person could possess, as though it had already betrayed her once and would do so again without mercy. He should have left then, should have turned away and dismissed everything he had heard as nothing more than the fragile reasoning of a woman preparing herself for a life she did not choose. But he could not, because in that moment he understood something he had never expected to find. She was not the cold, obedient bride arranged for him. She was someone who had already sacrificed something unseen, something vital, and had done so without witness, without complaint, and for the first time in years, Sebastian Blackwood felt the unfamiliar weight of doubt settle into his chest, not about her, but about himself, about the man she believed him to be. And as the fire inside the room faded to embers, leaving only the quiet echo of her final words, he stepped back into the shadows, no longer certain whether he had uncovered the truth or uncovered the cost of never being seen at all. He did not sleep that night, though the manor itself seemed to sink into a quiet so complete it felt almost sacred, and long after the last candle had been extinguished and every corridor had fallen still, Sebastian remained awake in the narrow servants' quarters, staring into the darkness as her words echoed with relentless precision, not loud, not dramatic, but steady in a way that refused to fade. I will not hope, she had said, and he had faced battles where steel met steel and men shouted their intentions without restraint. Yet nothing had ever unsettled him quite like that quiet surrender, because it was not weakness, it was choice, deliberate and unwavering. And for the first time in years, he found himself questioning not the world, but the version of himself that existed within it, the man she believed him to be. Morning came with a pale gray light that crept through tall windows and stretched across polished floors, and the household stirred back to life with the measured rhythm of routine, footsteps echoing, doors opening, voices kept low out of habit rather than necessity, and Sebastian moved among them unseen, another servant carrying out simple tasks with practiced precision. Yet his attention remained fixed on one thing alone, her. And when he saw Clara again, standing near the long dining table arranging flowers with careful hands, there was no trace of the girl he had heard the night before, her expression composed, her posture flawless, her voice even as she gave quiet instructions, and if not for the memory of that fragile honesty, he might have believed the performance entirely. She did not look at him, not truly, not in a way that recognized him as anything beyond his assumed role, and still, there was something in the way her gaze moved, attentive yet distant, as though part of her was always somewhere else, somewhere safer. And he realized then that her restraint was not for others, it was for herself, a boundary she had drawn and refused to cross. Throughout the day, he tested what he had begun to understand, small things at first, subtle shifts in tone and presence, a question asked too directly, a silence held too long, watching for any sign that the truth he had overheard would surface again. But she remained composed, unwavering, answering with politeness that revealed nothing, offering no crack in the surface she had so carefully maintained. And yet beneath it, he could feel it now, not see it, not hear it, but sense it in the pauses between her words, in the brief stillness before she turned away, in the way her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around something as simple as a teacup. By late afternoon, clouds gathered low over the estate, dimming the light and casting the manor in a muted shadow, and it was then, in the quiet space of the gallery where portraits of long-departed figures watched in silent judgment, that Sebastian found her alone once more, standing before a tall window, her reflection faint against the glass as she looked out across the grounds, as if measuring a future she had already decided to endure, and for a moment, he simply watched. The distance between them no more than a few steps, and yet impossibly wide, because he carried a truth she did not know he possessed, and it changed everything. He stepped forward then, deliberately, allowing his presence to break the silence, and she turned, not startled, not afraid, but composed as always, her eyes meeting his only briefly before shifting away, acknowledging him without seeing him, and in that instant, something inside him tightened again, not anger, not frustration, but something far more dangerous, something that felt like the beginning of understanding, and also the beginning of loss, because if she could hide something so real so completely, then how much of herself had she already buried beyond reach, even from him? The air between them felt heavier than it should have, as if the silence itself carried weight, and for a moment neither of them moved. Clara standing near the tall window with the fading light tracing a pale outline around her figure, Sebastian just a few steps away, yet separated by something far more immovable than distance, because he knew something she did not, and that knowledge had begun to change the way he saw everything she did. "Is there something you require?" she asked at last, her voice calm, polite, untouched by curiosity, the kind of tone reserved for those who existed only within the boundaries of duty, and he almost answered as he should have, with a simple request, something forgettable. Something that would allow this moment to pass without consequence. But instead, he hesitated, studying her in a way that no servant ever would, searching for any trace of the truth he had heard the night before, and finding nothing but composure so complete it felt almost unreal. "No, miss," he replied finally, his voice measured, controlled, yet there was a slight shift, something quieter beneath the surface, something that did not quite belong to the role he played. And for the briefest second, her gaze flickered back to him, not with recognition, but with something else, something that lingered just long enough to suggest awareness without understanding, as if some part of her sensed the difference but refused to follow it further. She turned back to the window, her attention returning to the distant grounds where the sky had deepened into a muted gray, and the first hint of evening settled across the estate. And it was then, in that quiet return to distance, that Sebastian made a decision he had not planned, something small, almost insignificant, yet entirely deliberate. "You should not stand so long in the cold light," he said, the words leaving him before caution could restrain them, and the moment they did, the air shifted, subtly, unmistakably, because it was not the kind of thing a servant would say, not the kind of concern that belonged within the strict lines of his disguise. Clara stilled, her hand resting lightly against the window frame, and for a heartbeat, she did not turn, as if weighing the words rather than reacting to them. And when she finally faced him again, her expression had not changed, but something behind it had sharpened, something observant, something careful. "You speak as though you are accustomed to being heard," she said quietly, and though her tone remained composed, there was a precision to it now, a quiet testing that mirrored his own. Sebastian inclined his head slightly, masking the sudden awareness that he had stepped too far beyond the role he wore. Yet instead of retreating, he held his ground, because something in her response had confirmed what he had begun to suspect. She was not unaware, not entirely. She simply chose not to question what did not serve her, and that choice, that restraint, fascinated him in a way he had not expected. "Perhaps I am not as forgettable as I appear," he answered, the words balanced carefully between truth and pretense, and for the first time, she allowed a faint shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but something close enough to suggest that she understood more than she revealed. "No one is as forgettable as they appear," she replied, and then, as if the moment had already extended beyond what she permitted herself, she turned away once more, drawing the invisible line back into place, and just like that, the distance returned, quiet, controlled, absolute. Sebastian remained where he was, watching as she moved toward the door, her steps steady, her posture unyielding. And yet now he could see it clearly, the effort behind it, the constant, silent discipline that held her together. And as she passed him without another word, without another glance, he understood something that unsettled him far more than any truth he had overheard. She was not hiding from the world. She was hiding from herself. And if he continued down this path, if he kept listening, kept watching, kept testing the fragile edges of her restraint, there would come a moment when that carefully constructed distance would no longer hold. And when it broke, it would not be quiet at all. The evening settled slowly over Whitmore Manor, the last traces of daylight fading into a muted blue that clung to the edges of the tall windows. And with it came a quiet that felt heavier than the hours before, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to unfold. And Sebastian felt it too, that subtle shift in the air, that quiet tension that had nothing to do with weather or routine and everything to do with her. He had told himself he would observe, nothing more, that he would gather what he came for and leave without disturbance. But already that resolve had begun to erode, replaced by something far less controlled, something that drew him back into her presence again and again despite every reason to remain distant. And so when the household gathered for the evening meal, he positioned himself where he could see without being seen, where he could listen without being noticed, another silent figure among many. And yet his focus never wavered from her. Clara sat at the long table with the composed grace expected of her, her movements precise, her voice measured as she responded when spoken to, offering nothing unnecessary, nothing revealing. And yet now that he knew what lay beneath, every small detail seemed altered, every pause held meaning, every glance withheld felt deliberate. And he watched as others spoke around her, discussing arrangements, finances, expectations tied to the marriage that loomed over everything like an unspoken command. And she listened, nodded, agreed when required, all without resistance, all without hesitation. And yet not once did she speak of herself. Not once did she claim any part of the future being decided in her name. A gentleman seated across from her remarked casually on the Duke's reputation, speaking of influence, of strength, of the certainty that such a union would secure not only stability but prestige. And there was a murmur of agreement, polite, approving, expected. And Clara inclined her head in quiet acknowledgement, her expression unchanged. But Sebastian saw it then, the smallest shift, a tightening at the corner of her fingers where they rested against the table, so slight it would have escaped anyone not looking for it. But he was looking, and that single detail struck him harder than any spoken word, because it was the only sign that any of this touched her at all. The conversation moved on, as it always did, drifting into safer topics, laughter returning in soft, controlled measures. But the moment lingered with him, that subtle fracture beneath her composure, that proof that she was not untouched, only disciplined beyond what anyone had the right to expect. And as the meal drew to a close and chairs shifted quietly against polished floors, Clara rose with the same measured grace she had maintained all evening, offering a polite farewell before excusing herself, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged. And yet something about the way she moved felt final, as though she were retreating not from the room, but from the weight of everything it contained. Sebastian did not follow immediately, though every instinct urged him to, instead remaining where he was, allowing the space to settle, the voices to fade, the illusion of normalcy to return. And only when the last trace of conversation had dissolved into silence did he move, stepping once more into the dim corridors where shadows stretched long and quiet. And as he walked, he understood with growing certainty that this was no longer about uncovering truth. It was about confronting it, because whatever lay beneath her silence was not something that would reveal itself easily. And if he chose to continue, if he chose to push beyond the boundaries she had so carefully drawn, he would not only uncover her truth, he would become part of it. The corridor stretched ahead in silence as Sebastian followed at a distance measured not in steps, but in restraint, the soft echo of Clara's footsteps guiding him through dim light and shadow until she turned down a narrower passage rarely used by guests, a place where the grandeur of the manor gave way to something quieter, more honest. and when she disappeared behind a partially closed door, he slowed, not with hesitation but with the careful precision of a man who understood that some moments could not be undone once witnessed. The faint glow of candlelight spilled through the narrow opening, flickering against the dark wood panels, and though he told himself to turn away, to respect the boundary she had so clearly drawn around herself, he did not, because something deeper than reason held him there, something that had been building since the moment he first heard her voice stripped of pretense. Inside, her composure had begun to slip, not entirely, not dramatically, but enough that the difference was unmistakable, as if the strength she carried throughout the day could only be sustained for so long before it demanded silence and solitude. And she moved slowly to the small writing desk near the window, her hands resting against its surface as though anchoring herself to something steady. For a long moment, she did not move, did not speak, and the quiet that filled the room felt different from the silence of the corridors, heavier, more intimate, as though it belonged only to her. Then, with a breath so soft it barely existed, she reached for a folded letter, one already worn at the edges as if it had been opened and closed too many times to count, and Sebastian felt a strange tension settle within him, not curiosity alone, but something closer to anticipation, because whatever she kept hidden, whatever truth she refused to let surface before others, it lived here. In moments like this, where no one was meant to see, she unfolded the paper carefully, her fingers steady despite the quiet weight behind them. And though he could not read the words from where he stood, he did not need to, because her expression changed in a way that revealed more than any ink ever could. Not sorrow exactly, not regret, but something quieter, something enduring, like a memory she refused to release even as it shaped every choice she made. It would have been easier, she whispered, not to anyone present, not to anyone who could answer, but to the silence itself, if I had never believed in anything more. And the words settled into the space between them, unseen, unheard by anyone but him. And yet they carried a clarity that struck deeper than anything spoken before, because this was not about him, not entirely. This was about something that existed long before he entered her life, something that had taught her to guard herself so completely that even hope had become a risk she would not take. She folded the letter again with deliberate care, returning it to its place as though sealing away not just paper, but everything it represented. And when she straightened, the composure returned, seamless, controlled, as if the moment of vulnerability had never existed at all, and Sebastian felt it then, the full weight of what he had chosen to witness. Because each truth he uncovered did not bring clarity, it brought complexity. It pulled him further into something he had never intended to understand. He stepped back then, finally, retreating into the shadows before the quiet of the room could betray his presence. But the image remained, fixed and unyielding. The way her voice had softened when she believed no one was listening. The way her strength faltered only in solitude. And as he moved once more through the silent corridors, he understood that whatever he had expected to find here, it was no longer enough. Because the truth was no longer something he could observe from a distance. It was something that was beginning, slowly and without warning, to change him. The night deepened around the manor, pressing its quiet against every wall and corridor until even the smallest sound felt deliberate. And Sebastian found himself standing once more at the edge of a decision he had not intended to face. Because what had begun as observation had become something far more difficult to control. Something that no longer allowed him the distance he had relied upon all his life. He could have left, could have ended the charade before it led him any further into a truth that was no longer simple. But instead he remained, drawn forward by something he did not fully understand, something that carried both clarity and consequence in equal measure. The following morning arrived with a pale light that softened the edges of the estate. The ground stretching outward beneath a sky still heavy with lingering clouds, and the routine of the household resumed as though nothing had shifted, as though the quiet revelations of the night before had not altered anything at all. Yet to Sebastian, everything felt different, every glance, every silence, every measured word now layered with meaning he could no longer ignore. He found her again in the gardens, where the air held a faint chill and the hedges stood trimmed with precise care, and Clara moved along the stone path with steady steps, her attention fixed on the small details that required tending. The simple act of adjusting a branch, of brushing away fallen leaves, tasks that seemed insignificant and yet carried the same quiet discipline she applied to everything else. And for a moment, he watched from a distance, uncertain whether to approach or remain unseen, because there was something fragile about this version of her, something less guarded than the composed figure within the manor walls. But as if sensing his presence without truly seeing it, she paused, her hand stilling against the edge of a rose stem, and though she did not turn immediately, there was a subtle shift in her posture, a quiet awareness that mirrored his own, and when she finally faced him, her expression was calm, but her eyes held a clarity that felt sharper than before, as though the distance she maintained was no longer simply habit, but choice reinforced by something deeper. "You have a way of appearing where you are not expected," she said, her voice even, though there was a quiet weight behind the words, not accusation, not curiosity, but something closer to observation, and Sebastian inclined his head slightly, allowing the role he wore to steady him even as something beneath it resisted. "I go where I am needed," he replied, though the answer felt insufficient even as he spoke it, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them filled with something unspoken yet undeniably present. She studied him then, not openly, not in a way that would break propriety, but with a precision that suggested she was measuring something she could not quite name, and he felt it, that quiet scrutiny, sharper than any question, more revealing than any direct confrontation, and for the first time since he had stepped into this role, he understood that she was not unaware of him, not entirely. She simply had not chosen to see him until now. "You speak differently," she said at last, the words simple, but deliberate, and though her tone remained composed, there was a faint narrowing of distance in the way she held his gaze, as though testing whether the difference she sensed would reveal itself more clearly if she allowed it. Sebastian did not answer immediately, because the truth stood too close to the surface, too close to being uncovered if he allowed even a fraction too much to slip, and yet silence itself had become dangerous, because she was not a woman who filled silence with assumption. She let it remain until it spoke for itself. "Perhaps I have learned to listen more than I speak," he said finally, choosing his words with care, and for a brief moment, something in her expression shifted, not fully, not enough to break the composure she held so tightly, but enough to suggest recognition, not of who he was, but of something within him that felt unexpectedly familiar. She turned away then, her attention returning to the garden as though the moment had already reached its limit, and yet her voice carried back to him, quieter now, almost reflective. "Listening can be more dangerous than speaking," she said, and the words lingered between them, heavier than they should have been, because they were not a warning given lightly. They were something she had learned, something she had lived, and as Sebastian remained where he stood, watching the careful distance she re-established once more, he understood that whatever truth he continued to uncover would not remain contained for much longer, because she was beginning to see not who he was, but that he was not who he claimed to be, and when that realization fully took shape, neither of them would be able to remain untouched by it. The warning lingered long after her voice had faded, settling into Sebastian's thoughts with a quiet persistence he could not dismiss, because she had not spoken as someone guessing at danger. She had spoken as someone who had already faced it and chosen to survive it without witness. And for the first time since stepping into this deception, he began to question whether he was uncovering her truth or trespassing into something that was never meant to be seen. The days that followed did not bring distance as he had expected, but something far more unsettling, a gradual narrowing of the space between them that neither of them acknowledged yet both seemed to feel. Because where once she had moved through the manor untouched by his presence, now there were moments, brief and almost imperceptible, where her attention lingered a fraction longer than it should have, where silence between them carried weight instead of absence. And each of those moments left him with a growing certainty that she was no longer ignoring what she sensed, she was choosing how to respond to it. It happened again in the late afternoon, when the sky dimmed early and the house fell into that familiar hush that came before evening, and Sebastian found himself in the smaller sitting room near the west wing, a place rarely used except by those who preferred quiet over company, and she was there already, seated near the fireplace with a book resting in her lap, though her eyes were not moving across the page. Her attention fixed somewhere far beyond it, as though the act of reading had become nothing more than a shield. He should have left, should have allowed the distance she so carefully maintained to remain intact. But instead he stepped forward, his presence breaking the stillness in a way that felt intentional, and she looked up immediately, not startled, not uncertain, but aware, and that awareness changed something between them, something subtle yet undeniable. "You return often," she said, her voice even, though the simplicity of the words carried a quiet weight, and he did not pretend not to understand what she meant, because this was no longer about chance or coincidence. It was about pattern, about presence that could no longer be dismissed as accidental, and he met her gaze with a steadiness that mirrored her own. "Perhaps I have found reason to," he answered, and though the words were measured, there was truth within them that neither of them chose to name. She studied him then, more openly than before, not breaking propriety, but no longer avoiding the observation either, and for a moment, the distance between servant and lady seemed to blur, not entirely, not enough to shatter the illusion, but enough to suggest that she was no longer certain where that boundary truly lay, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, not softer, but more precise. "You listen too closely," she said, and the words settled between them with unmistakable clarity, because they were no longer a general truth, they were directed, intentional, and for the first time, Sebastian understood that she knew more than she revealed, not everything, not the full extent of who he was, but enough to recognize that he had crossed into a space she had not permitted. He could have denied it, could have retreated behind the safety of his role, but something within him resisted the ease of that lie, and instead, he held her gaze, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to acknowledge what had already been spoken without words. "And yet you continue to speak," he replied, and there was no challenge in his tone, only a quiet observation that mirrored her own, and for a brief moment, something in her expression shifted, not breaking, not yielding, but softening at the edges in a way that suggested understanding rather than resistance. She closed the book then, setting it aside with deliberate care, and rose to her feet, the movement smooth, composed, yet carrying a quiet finality. "Some things are easier said when they are not meant to be heard," she said, and though the words could have been dismissive, they were not. They were something else, something closer to confession wrapped in restraint, and as she moved past him, the faint brush of air left in her wake carried a weight that lingered far longer than it should have. Because she had not denied it, she had not withdrawn completely. She had acknowledged the space between them and allowed it to exist without resolution. And as Sebastian remained where he stood, the quiet of the room closing in once more, he understood that whatever line he had crossed, there was no returning to the distance that had once protected them both, because she was no longer pretending not to see. She was choosing how much she was willing to reveal, and that choice was far more dangerous than ignorance ever could have been. The shift between them could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. It lingered in every silence, in every glance that lasted a fraction longer than it should have, and Sebastian began to understand that what had once been observation had turned into something far more dangerous, something that neither of them could fully control, because she no longer avoided him, and he no longer kept his distance. It revealed itself in small moments first, subtle changes that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to him, they carried weight, because he knew what she hid, and he knew the cost of it. That morning, the manor moved with its usual rhythm, quiet voices, measured steps, the distant sound of doors opening and closing like a steady pulse beneath everything. And yet when Clara entered the main hall, something in the air shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that he felt it immediately, because her composure, though still present, no longer carried the same absolute distance it once had, as though the careful control she maintained had begun to strain beneath something unspoken. She paused near the long table, reviewing a set of documents placed before her, her attention focused, her expression calm, and yet when Sebastian approached, there was no hesitation in her awareness this time, no delay in recognition. She knew he was there before he spoke, and when she looked up, her gaze met his directly, not as one might acknowledge a servant, but as one might acknowledge a question, "You should not remain where you are not meant to be," she said quietly, and the words carried a meaning that extended far beyond the surface. Not a reprimand, not a command, but a statement of understanding. And for a moment, Sebastian said nothing, because this was no longer a game of concealment. This was something else, something closer to confrontation without accusation. "And yet I remain," he replied, his voice steady, but there was no longer any effort to make. The answer seemed simple, and something in her expression shifted again, not surprise, not discomfort, but something more measured, as if she had expected that answer long before he spoke it. She set the documents aside with deliberate care, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, grounding herself in a way he had come to recognize, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, though no less precise. "Then you should understand the cost," she said, and there was no warning in her tone, no attempt to dissuade him, only truth, offered without adornment, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because she was not trying to stop him. She was allowing him to continue, fully aware of where it would lead. The silence that followed stretched between them, not empty, but filled with something neither of them chose to name. And in that moment, Sebastian realized that the distance she had once maintained was not gone. It had changed. It had shifted into something far more deliberate, something that no longer kept him out, but instead allowed him just close enough to understand what he was choosing to step into. "You speak as though there is no choice," he said at last, though the words felt incomplete, even as he spoke them, and she held his gaze for a moment longer than before, her eyes steady, unguarded in a way that felt both rare and fleeting. "There is always a choice," she replied, "but not all choices leave something behind to return to." And with that, she turned away, the moment closing not with finality, but with quiet acceptance, as if what had been set in motion could no longer be undone. Sebastian remained where he stood, her words settling into him with a weight that did not fade, because for the first time, he understood that this was no longer about discovering her truth. It was about what that truth would demand of him. And as he watched her disappear into the quiet of the manor, he knew with growing certainty that whatever came next would not be controlled, would not be distant, and would not leave either of them unchanged. By the time evening returned, the manor no longer felt like a place of quiet routine, but something suspended between restraint and revelation, and Sebastian understood that whatever line had once separated observation from involvement had already been crossed, not in a single moment, but in a series of choices neither of them had chosen to stop, and now there was no space left for distance to protect them. The gathering that night was smaller than before, fewer voices, fewer distractions, yet somehow the tension felt sharper, more defined, as though the absence of noise had stripped everything down to what could no longer be ignored, and Clara moved through it with the same composure she had always carried, greeting guests, responding when required, her voice steady, her posture unyielding, and yet to Sebastian, every detail had changed, because he could see the effort behind it now, the constant control that held her together, and more importantly, he could see where it began to falter. It happened when a guest, unaware of the weight carried beneath the surface, spoke lightly of the Duke once more, of the impending marriage, of the advantages it would bring, the security, the expectation that such a union would naturally lead to affection in time, and there was a quiet agreement among those present, polite, unquestioning, as though such an outcome were inevitable, and Clara listened as she always did, her expression composed, her response measured. "That would be fortunate," she said, and the words were perfect in their simplicity, flawless in their delivery. Yet something in the pause before them revealed more than the words themselves, and Sebastian felt it immediately, that subtle fracture beneath the surface, that quiet resistance she refused to allow into her voice. The conversation continued, but he no longer heard it, because his attention had narrowed entirely to her, to the way she held herself, to the way her hands remained still despite the tension he knew they carried, to the way she maintained the illusion so completely that no one else could see what stood just beneath it. And something within him shifted then, not gradually, not uncertainly, but with a clarity that left no room for retreat, because he understood that watching was no longer enough, that remaining in the shadows no longer protected anything, least of all her. When the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, their voices fading into the distance as the doors closed behind them, Clara remained where she was for a moment longer than necessary, standing in the quiet that followed, her composure still intact, but the absence of observers seemed to loosen something unseen, something she did not allow to show, and then she turned, moving toward the far end of the room where the light dimmed and the space felt less exposed. And it was there that Sebastian stepped forward, no longer content to remain unseen, no longer willing to pretend that the distance between them still existed as it once had. She stopped when she sensed him, not startled, not uncertain, but aware, and when she turned to face him, there was no attempt to dismiss his presence this time, no polite acknowledgement followed by retreat, only a stillness that held the weight of everything left unspoken. "You continue," she said quietly, and though the words were simple, they carried more meaning than any accusation, because they were not questioning what he did, they were recognizing that he had chosen to do it, and Sebastian met her gaze without hesitation, because there was no longer any value in concealment, not in the way it had once existed between them. "So do you," he replied, and the truth of it settled into the space between them with a quiet finality, because neither of them had stepped away, neither of them had chosen to end what had begun to unfold, and in that moment, something shifted again, not breaking, not resolving, but deepening into something neither of them could ignore. She held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression unchanged, yet her eyes no longer distant, no longer guarded in the way they had been before, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a softness that did not weaken her words, but made them more precise. "Then do not pretend you do not understand," she said. And there was no challenge in it, no demand, only truth offered without protection. And as the silence settled once more, Sebastian realized that whatever came next would no longer be hidden behind roles or distance, because she had stopped pretending not to see, and he had stopped pretending to be someone else. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt inevitable, as though everything that had been held back between them had finally reached a point where it could no longer remain unspoken. And yet neither of them moved, neither of them rushed to fill it, because whatever came next would not be undone once it was said. Clara stood where she was, the dim light casting a soft shadow along the floor between them. And for the first time since he had known her, there was no effort to disguise the awareness in her gaze, no attempt to return to the distance that had once protected them both, and that alone told Sebastian more than any words could have. "You should not have listened," she said at last, and her voice was quiet, not sharp, not accusing, but carrying a weight that settled deeper than anger ever could, and he understood immediately that she did not mean a single moment, not one conversation overheard, but everything, every step he had taken beyond the boundaries she had drawn, every truth he had chosen to uncover. He could have denied it, could have stepped back into the role he had worn so carefully, but that distance no longer existed, and so he did not retreat. "You should not have spoken as if no one would hear," he replied, and the words were not meant as accusation, but as acknowledgement, because they both knew now that what had passed between them was no longer hidden, no longer contained. For a moment, something flickered across her expression, not surprise, not fear, but something far more fragile, something that existed only in the space where truth was no longer denied, and then it was gone, replaced once more by the composure she had spent so long perfecting. "Then you understand," she said, and there was no question in it, only certainty, and Sebastian felt it then, the full weight of everything he had uncovered, not as scattered pieces, but as a single, undeniable truth. She had not rejected him, she had not dismissed him, she had removed herself from the possibility before it could ever become something she could not survive losing. "You chose to feel nothing," he said, though the words felt incomplete even as they left him, because what she had done was far more deliberate than that. Her gaze held his, steady, unwavering, and for a moment, the quiet strength he had seen in her began to shift, not breaking, but revealing something beneath it, something that had always been there, carefully contained. "No," she said softly. "I chose not to hope." And the distinction settled between them with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, because hope was not absence, it was risk, it was vulnerability, It was the one thing she refused to allow herself. The silence that followed was different now, no longer filled with uncertainty, but with understanding. And it was that understanding that changed everything. Because Sebastian could no longer pretend that what stood between them was simple, could no longer dismiss her restraint as indifference. And yet that knowledge came with its own weight, its own consequence. Because to understand her was to recognize the distance she had already placed between them, a distance built not on misunderstanding, but on choice. "You believe it will not matter," he said. After a moment, his voice quieter now, not challenging, but searching for something he could not yet define, and she did not look away, did not retreat from the truth he had already uncovered. "It will matter," she replied, and for the first time, there was something unguarded in her voice, something that carried the faintest trace of what she had refused to name. "That is precisely why I cannot allow it to." And with that, the space between them shifted once more, not widening, not closing, but settling into something neither of them could ignore, because the truth had been spoken now, not in full, not in every detail, but in the way that mattered most. And as Sebastian stood there, facing her not as a servant, not as a stranger, but as the man she had already decided she could not afford to hope for, he understood that whatever came next would no longer be shaped by illusion, but by the quiet, undeniable truth they had both chosen to face. The truth did not bring relief. It did not soften the distance between them or resolve the tension that had been building with quiet precision. Instead, it settled into the space like something permanent, something that could not be undone. And for the first time since stepping into her world, Sebastian understood that knowing her truth did not grant him any power over it. It only revealed the depth of what she had already chosen. Clara did not step away, did not retreat into the safety of silence as she had before, but neither did she move closer. She remained exactly where she was, as if the distance between them had been measured long before this moment and could not be altered now without consequence. And there was something in that stillness that unsettled him more than any resistance ever could, because it was not uncertainty, it was certainty held. Without hesitation, "You think it is a matter of choice alone," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, stripped of the control he had relied upon. Because this was no longer a conversation that could be contained within roles or expectations, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, though something beneath it had begun to shift, something that no longer belonged entirely to restraint. "It is the only part that belongs to me," she replied, and the words carried a quiet finality that left no room for argument, because everything else, the arrangement, the expectations, the future already decided in her name. None of it had been hers to shape, and so she had claimed the only thing she could, the choice to feel nothing that could be taken from her. Sebastian took a step forward then, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough that the space between them no longer felt abstract, no longer something that could be ignored, and for the first time, he allowed the truth he had been holding back to rise without restraint. "And if you are wrong," he said, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as something closer to a question he had not intended to ask, because it was not her certainty he was questioning, it was the cost of it. Clara did not answer immediately, and in that brief silence, something in her composure faltered, not breaking, not collapsing, but shifting just enough to reveal the weight she carried beneath it. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, not weaker, but more honest than it had been before. "Then I will not know," she said, and the simplicity of the words carried a weight that settled deeper than anything else she had spoken, because it was not avoidance, it was acceptance. She had chosen not to risk something she believed she could not survive losing, even if that meant never knowing what might have been. The quiet that followed was no longer tense, no longer uncertain. It was something else. Entirely, something that held both understanding and distance at once. And Sebastian realized then that there was nothing he could say that would change what she had already decided, because her choice was not based on misunderstanding, it was based on experience, on something that had taught her that hope was not a promise, but a risk she could not afford. "You have already decided," he said at last, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of everything he had come to understand, and she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth without hesitation. "Yes," she replied, and there was no apology in it, no regret, only the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to survive by choosing what to lose before it could be taken. Sebastian held her gaze for a moment longer, the silence stretching between them not as a barrier, but as something that could no longer be crossed without consequence. And for the first time since stepping into this deception, he understood that what stood between them was not something he could uncover or control. It was something he would have to face, not as a stranger, not as an observer, but as the man she had already decided not to hope for. And as the quiet settled once more, he knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what he had learned, but by what he chose to do with it. The quiet did not break. It deepened, settling into something that felt less like an ending and more like a point from which nothing could return unchanged. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to disguise, nothing left to soften, only the truth that now existed fully between them, undeniable and unguarded. Sebastian understood then that there was only one choice left to make, not about her, not about what she believed or what she had chosen, but about himself, about whether he would remain within the boundaries of the role he had created or step beyond it and accept the consequences that would follow. And as that realization settled into him with quiet certainty, the last thread of hesitation fell away. "You are wrong about one thing," he said at last, his voice steady, not raised, not forceful, but carrying a clarity that did not belong to the man she believed him to be. And for the first time, Clara's composure faltered not in subtlety, but in stillness, as if something in his tone had shifted just enough to break the pattern she had relied upon. And her gaze sharpened, searching, measuring something she could not yet define. Sebastian took another step forward, closing the distance not completely, but enough that the separation between them could no longer be dismissed as circumstance. And when he spoke again, there was no trace of the servant he had pretended to be, only the man who had listened, who had understood, and who had chosen not to remain hidden any longer. "You believe that hope is what will break you," he said, each word deliberate. "But it is not hope that destroys, it is the belief that you were never meant to have it." And the words settled into the space between them with a quiet weight that neither of them could ignore, because they were not an argument. They were something closer to truth spoken without protection. Clara did not move, but something in her expression changed, not collapsing, not surrendering, but shifting in a way that revealed the conflict she had kept so carefully contained. And for the first time, there was uncertainty there, not about him, but about the certainty she had held for so long. "You speak as though you know what you are asking," she said, her voice softer now, not weaker, but no longer untouched by what lay beneath it. And Sebastian met her gaze without hesitation, because there was no longer any reason to remain hidden, not when everything that mattered had already been exposed. "I do," he replied, and then, after a pause that felt both brief and infinite, he spoke the truth she had never allowed herself to consider. "And I know that you deserve the choice to hope, not the obligation to deny it." And in that moment, something broke, not loudly, not visibly, but in the quiet space where certainty once stood, and Clara's composure wavered, not disappearing, but no longer absolute, as if the foundation she had built her restraint upon had shifted beneath her without warning. She looked at him then, truly looked, not at the role he had worn, not at the distance she had maintained, but at something beyond it, something she had refused to acknowledge. Until now, and in that silence, understanding came not as realization, but as recognition, because the difference she had sensed, the truth she had not named, now stood clearly before her, impossible to ignore. "Who are you?" she asked, and the question was not spoken in fear, not in accusation, but in quiet certainty, as if she already knew that the answer would change everything. Sebastian did not answer immediately, because this was the moment from which nothing would return unchanged, the moment where truth would no longer be partial, no longer hidden behind observation or restraint. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the distance he had once relied upon, only the quiet weight of everything that had led them here. "I am the man you chose not to hope for," he said, and the words settled between them with a finality that neither of them could escape, because the truth had come not as revelation alone, but as consequence. And as Clara stood there, facing him without the protection of certainty, The choice she had made began to shift into something far more dangerous than hope itself, something that could no longer be ignored, because it had already begun to exist.